thank you very much for this introduction. In my talk, I will just give you a few brief remarks about different topics that are very prominent in the contemporary discussion about agency. And at the very end of my talk, I will try to tie these three different topics together. I will just try to show how they all hang together, and according to my opinion, there's one single problem which gives rise to these different discussions in the contemporary debate about agency. So in my talk, I will first refer to the discussion about event causation and agent causation. Then I will talk about reasons and causes. As you might know, there's a big discussion in the debate whether reasons are reducible to causes, whether reasons are a special form of cause for an action, or whether reasons are something altogether different. And finally, I will talk about personal and subpersonal levels of explanation. This was also already touched in the previous talk, like if neurophysiologists or if experimental scientists, if they try to find out something about human agency, then very often they are dealing with these two levels. On the one hand, they talk about intentions, desires, plans that a person is having, is trying to pursue, and on the other hand, they go to subpersonal explanations. They talk about certain brain functions. They talk about certain parts of the brain doing certain things which enable a person to form an intention and so on. So we will see how these two levels are related and what problems might arise if the separation of these two levels is not taken into consideration. So my first topic will be causation. I will start with event causation. As you might know, historically speaking, event causation is, at least for the last 300 years, the standard account of causation. Most causation theorists, they follow a model which was prominently defended and proposed by David Hume. And I will just give you a few quotes from Hume. One's from the treatise, the other one is from the inquiry. And what Hume is trying to argue for is that at the end, causation is just the sequence, the follow-up of separate and distinct events. So that's very clearly, you can see it here. So the idea is, if you observe a causal process, then what you see are one event following another event. If you see this sequence of events for many times, then you get this idea that there must be some regularity behind this sequence of events, and then the mind forms this concept of a causal chain or of a causal process going on. But the basic idea is what you have are events, and they are loose and separate. So ontologically speaking, what you have are just single events following each other, but they are not somehow connected. So there's no tie or cement in the universe tying, gluing them all together, but they are just single separated events following each other. So you have this model of the causal relation, or of causation. Causation is nothing else but a causal relation between different events. And this causal relation is at the end reducible to certain regularity notions. Like you have certain similarity concepts, you have certain regularity concepts, and causation is nothing else but these regularity, these regular features which you can detect. Now, when it comes now to agency, to human action, and you have this causal model in the background, and if you try to adopt or to use this causal model for understanding human agency, then this creates some tensions. If you just use this model, then you might say, well, an action is nothing else but a bodily movement. And this bodily movement, that's an event, right? And this event has certain causes, some prior events. And what are these prior events? Well, they must be some other causes, some events. And generally people talk about mental events. So the idea is, generally you have, that's the basic model, you have event 1, which is followed by event 2. So this is the cause, this is the effect. There's this causal relation. And when it comes to human action, then you have the event 2, that would be a bodily movement. And then, of course, the question is what causes this bodily movement? And the most obvious answer will be, well, that's another event, and it must be some kind of mental event. Or to be more precise, most people would say it's an event that can also be described in mental terms. So the idea is actions are caused by certain events, by specific events, and these events can also be described as mental events. I'm just underlining this point because most action theorists or most people proposing this account of human, or most people using this concept of causation for explaining human action, they would also be in some form reductionist, and they would therefore say, well, if you have these special events, they are of course physiological or physical events, but they can also be described in a mental form. Like otherwise you would have a certain form of dualism, right? You would have like there are mental events, there are physical events, and if you want to avoid this, then it's like an obvious way is to say, well, what you have ontologically speaking are physical events, but you can also describe them in a mental form. This is a well-known quote from Davidson. Donald Davidson is one of the most famous proponents of an event causal approach to explain human action. Davidson was also one of those philosophers shaping the contemporary debate. And at the end of one of his most influential papers, Action, Reasons and Causes, he writes, I quote, "Why on earth should a cause turn an action into a mere happening and a person into a helpless victim? It's because we tend to assume, at least in the arena of action, that a cause demands a causer, agency and agent. Some causes have no agents. Primary among these are those states and chains of state in persons which, because they are reasons as well as causes, make persons voluntary agents." I would like to draw the attention particular to two things Davidson underlines within this quote. First, he says there are some causes and these causes have no agents. So he's explicitly saying we can explain human action without referring to an agent. All what we need are some specific causes. So if you want to explain a bodily movement as an action, you don't have to refer to an agent as such. It's enough to refer to some special causes. And the second point is these special causes are some states or chains of state in the person. So Davidson is proposing, in order to explain human action, all what you need is you have to focus on certain events. These events have to be the causes of bodily movements. And if these events have some specific features, then they can count as the cause for a bodily movement which qualifies as an action. And where do we look for these special events? We look not at the personal level, but we look inside the person. So the idea is, in order to find out whether you performed an action, I'm not I'm not going to look for some causes on a personal level, but I'm looking inside you, so to speak. So the person gets reduced to a certain arena, to a certain place where potential causes for an action take place or are to be found. So I brought this quote in order to show you that event causation, when it comes to agency, has a certain reductionist thrust. You're not looking for the person doing something, but you're looking for certain states, processes, events taking place within the person. And these are the relevant causes for an action. So the idea is that the talk about the agent can be reduced to the talk about certain states, events in the agent, and these states and events can be described also as mental states and events. Now, what you have is, or this leads, this like reductionist analysis of human action leads to what in the current discussion is dubbed the problem of the disappearing agent. I don't know whether you heard about this problem, but there are like many people, even if they are sympathetic with event causal accounts, they say, or they would agree that the agent as such is not visible anymore, that the agent as such does not play any role in the explanation of human action, and this creates a certain problem. So it seems to be that within this context of an event causal account, if you still want to talk about the agent, then it seems that the agent has to be conceived of as something fundamentally different and distinct from the other like metaphysical framework. Like the overall metaphysical framework is spelled out in event causal terms, what is going on in the world or how you best explain the world, that is just in certain causal chains between events going on. And now if you still want to maintain the talk about the agent, and not just in a loose sense, but in a proper way of speaking, if you really want to defend the notion, the robust notion of an agent, then it seems that that's a metaphysical concept which is somehow foreign and strange within this event causal framework. Think, for instance, of Chisholm. I don't know whether you are familiar with the causal, like with the action theory of Chisholm, but Chisholm, he would say, well, what you have, like he would say this account of causation is in principle correct. I'm accepting this event causal picture, but I still want to defend that the agent as such is the author of an action. I'm not agreeing that some events inside myself are causing me to do something. And then Chisholm was saying, well, at the end it seems that the agent is just it's like God, you know. The agent is somewhere above the event causal chains, and then once an action takes place, the agent seems to have some magical powers, and he can somehow interfere with these event causal chains and produce an action. So it seems once you accept this model, then the agent is somehow out of the view. And in order to reintegrate the agent, you have to ascribe to him somehow like magical or divine powers. And Chisholm was also saying, like, each of us is a first unmoved mover. So we have this power to just to begin an action, we have the power to interfere somehow with these causal chains and thereby bringing about an intention in our brain. Actually, that was his view, that we are just causing intentions in our brain, and then the brain starts to execute this whole event causal chain, which leads at the end to a bodily movement like raising your arm. Now, so this is one problem, the problem of the disappearing agent. And if you want to bring the agent back into the picture, then you have to ascribe to him some very strong, almost divine powers. And then there's another problem if you ascribe to an event causal picture, and that's you have to distinguish somehow between two types of causes, right? On the one hand, you have mere causes causing some very natural processes, like take the causation of an earthquake. You don't need any mental descriptions for describing what is going on when an earthquake is taking place. That you need just the ordinary natural causes. But when it comes to human action, then it seems you need another type of event cause. You need some causes that are not only causing a bodily movement, but they have also to rationalize the movement. They have to make it understandable why the agent was executing this movement and not another one, why the agent was choosing to go this direction and not the other direction. So the problem seems to be that you have mere natural causes, and then you have this event agent causes, and at this level of the event agent causes, again, you would have to ascribe to the causes some forms of intentionality, some forms of mentality, some forms of rationality, because otherwise you cannot rationalize the bodily movement. So it seems that there's at least some form of dualism lurking also in event causal accounts, because they have to distinguish between mere natural causes and agent event causes. Now, if someone, so this brings me now to the next point, how can we relate agent causation to event causation? So the first point was I wanted to make clear that an event causal account to agency creates certain problems, problem of the disappearing agent and the problem that you have to distinguish between two very different types of causes creating bodily movements, right? You have to distinguish between bodily movements which are intentional and not intentional, and this mark of intentionality has to be somehow mirrored on the level of causes. Now, I was already referring to this topic before when I was making reference to Chisholm. The question is now, how can we, if we want to bring the agent back into the picture, then what options do we have? So one option is to say, as Chisholm did, well, this is basically the correct picture. We are ascribing to an event causal view, but we want also to defend agent causation. So people doing this, they would say that agent causation is a very special form of causation which applies only to human agency. So this would be like Chisholm's view, right? When it comes to intentional, rational agency, then you have to use the model of agent causation. That's just a second form of causation, distinct from event causation. So basically you have two forms of causation. You have event causation ruling like all the natural world, and then you have these very specific instances of agent causation which are only like popping up, so to say, once we are intentionally bringing an action about. So the problem is that the agent is then a fundamentally separate and distinct element in an overall event causal metaphysical picture. It's also no wonder that most of the people ascribing to such a combined or mixed view, they see agents also in a dualistic fashion, like agents are some immaterial substances that are somehow interfering with the material order of the world. The other option you could take, which not so many people, that's a route that not so many people take, but I think this is the more like convincing and more promising route. This would be to try to reduce event causation to substance causation. So the idea would be to turn, so to say, the table around. Event causal accounts, they try to reduce agent causation to event causation, right? Just remember again Davidson saying, why do we need the agent if we talk about actions? All we need are some specific events taking place within the person. And this would now be the difference, like the other strategy, which would say, well, why do we need event causation? Maybe the whole concept of event causation is wrong-headed, and we can reduce it to substance causation. So the only proper form of causation is substance causation. Now, one philosopher proposing this account is, for instance, E.G. Lowe, and this would be like his proposal how to reduce event causation to substance causation. Lowe is saying if you have an event C that causes another event E, then this is only the case if and only if there is an agent A and some manner of acting X. So the agent A acts in the manner X, and in such a way that C, the event C, consists in A's Xing, and A by Xing directly brings about E. So that the idea is, when we talk about events, like events in terms of actions, then what brings this event about is always a certain substance, in this case an agent, doing something. Once the agent does something, then automatically an event gets manifested, so to say, then an event takes place. But it's not the event causing anything, but it's the agent by doing something, like by acting upon another substance, that he causes or she causes the other substance to behave in a certain way. So the basic idea is you have substances having certain capacities, and if these capacities are manifested, then of course that materializes in forms of an event, but the event is always depending on the substance doing something. So it's not the substance being, so to say, the primary ontological object, but it's always secondary. It's dependent on substances performing some forms of action. So you might talk about, or you might think about substances as powerful particulars. Substances have certain powers, and if these substances are in the right circumstances, then these powers get manifested. And you might say that the agent is just a very particular form of a substance. So you have, like, within the class of substances, you have a subclass, and this subclass are agents. Now, what is the distinction between substances in general, powerful particular in general, and agents? You might say we have mere powerful particulars. These are just substances disposing of a certain causal features, and these causal features get manifested in specific circumstances. And then you have the whole range of circumstances in which these powers can get manifested. You might have certain particulars that meet only, like that can manifest their manifestations in almost all circumstances, and you might have other substances which like manifest their dispositions or their causal powers only in very, very specific circumstances. Just think of an electron, for instance. You might say, well, an electron is a powerful particular, and the powerfulness of the electron consists in its being negatively charged, and by being negatively charged, it has the power to repel other electrons. And that's a feature which the electron will show in almost all circumstances, or maybe even if all circumstances. I don't know what physicists think about this, but probably the electron will always show this feature. Or you might think of a radon atom. Apparently radon atoms, they just decay in a very spontaneous way. We cannot exactly say when and why they do it. So it seems again that they don't need some specific circumstances for showing this power. They just do it. And of course you might have like other powers, like the water has the power to dissolve salt, however only if it's not saturated already. So there you would have the range of circumstances would now be more narrowed down. So if the water has already enough salt in it, then it cannot dissolve more salt. So this would be like the realm of mere or natural powerful particulars. Now when it comes to agents, then you might say agents in general have a first-person perspective. And if an agent has a first-person perspective, then this first-person perspective gives to the agent already a certain minimal form of freedom. So it's not, you cannot reduce the agent anymore to just a mere bundle of stimuli and certain responses to these stimuli. So there's, like, you might say, complete reduction is not possible anymore, but because of this first-person perspective, there is some basic form of agency already in place. So you might say that also animals, if they have consciousness, if they have a first-person perspective, then they have already a minimal form of agency. And then within the animal kingdom, you might say there is free and rational agency, and that's just the agency that is generally associated with human agency, and maybe there are also some other higher developed mammals that dispose, at least in a lesser way, but still that also disposed of some forms of rational and free agency. But so the idea would be you have powerful substances in general, then you have a subclass, agents, and then within this subclass of agents you have like minimal agents on the one hand. These are all the agents endowed with a first-person perspective, having consciousness, and on the other hand you have like agents having rational and free agency, which presupposes what, for instance, Lynn Rudder-Baker would call a robust first-person perspective. That is the capacity to have self-consciousness, to think of oneself as oneself. So let me just briefly outline what rational and free agency might consist in. So you might say an agent is a species of a substance with the distinctive power, among many other powers of course, to freely bring about some goal-directed action A. So the one mark of rational and free agency is just to deliver among different possible courses of action and to choose the course which is most suitable. In the literature you find quite often this this concept of a two-way power. So you are somehow can go either that way or the other way, and it depends on you. It's not random whether you go this way or the other way, but it's really up to you which way you choose. And it's crucial that this two-way power is also reason responsive. So it's not just some forces attracting you either in that way or in the other way, but it's really like you're deliberating, you're choosing in the light of certain reasons, whether you want to go either for A or for non-A. This brings me now to my second topic of the talk, that's reasons and causes. Like if free and rational agency consists in the power to be reasons responsive, to be able to evaluate a certain course of action in the light of reasons, then we have to talk, or then we have to think what reasons might be. The standard account is saying reasons must be causes, right? And causes, of course, are events. So the basic idea is if reasons are not causes, then reasons cannot enter the causal network, and then reasons cannot contribute in some way to a causal explanation of action, which is a reasonable way to address the problem. So Davidson and others, they would say a mere rationalization of an action is not enough, right? If you could imagine, like, you do a certain action, and then if I'm asking you, well, why did you perform this action? Then you might give me like whatever reason you might want. This reason, it might be able to rationalize the action, but you could still lie to me, right? You could say, well, my reason for doing this was A, but in fact it was B. So a mere rationalization would not be enough. It would make your action understandable to me, but still it would not explain what led you to perform this action. So the idea is, if a reason is not also the cause of an action, then a reason alone, so to say, is not good enough for explaining why something happened, because it could always be the wrong reason you're telling. I would, however, now, before I'm addressing this problem, I would like to propose another account to think about reasons. And I would say if you identify reasons with causes, then this gets you into various troubles. On the one hand, I think that reasons are abstract entities, because reasons are mainly, the main feature of reasons is that they have a certain content. And it seems that the content is something abstract. Like we could all, or I could tell you the reason to do a certain thing, and then I think you could all access this reason. It's not that all of you would have a different reason for doing X, but it would always be the same reason, because you're accessing the reason from your perspective, you're evaluating the same reason from your perspective, and you're somehow like thinking whether this reason is a good one or not. But I don't think that it's reasonable to say that all of you have different reasons to do the same thing, but it seems to be more economic to say, well, there's one reason to do, or the best reason for doing X is Y. You're all accessing this reason Y, and then you're adopting it in the light of your rational process. So it seems to be that reasons are abstract entities. They are not, causes are always something concrete, right? In order to enter a causal process, it must be, the cause must be located somehow in space and time. But reasons, it seems, they have a certain content. The content is that what makes a reason interesting for us. And contents don't seem to be something that is locatable in space and time, but it seems to be something abstract. So I think that different agents can access the same reason content. And secondly, I think also that what makes a reason a good reason or a strong reason, that's the content and not the causal force. Like if you think again of like an earthquake, then you might say, well, the causes of the earthquake, there are just like many different causes, but at the end, this was the triggering cause. This was the cause having most power, and therefore the earthquake, like this was the cause giving the start to the earthquake. But when it comes to reason, I don't think that this model is appropriate. It's rather, if I provide you a bad reason to do something, then most probably you will not do it. You will simply say, well, that's not a very good reason, so why should I do it? It's not a causal force pushing you or not pushing you to do something, but it's rather that you would just say, well, this reason you're giving me, that's not very logical, it's not very rational for me to do it. So to have a good reason, to have a strong reason is something different from having the strongest force. Like having the strongest force, that would just be give you the right push, right? But in terms of reason, it seems that it's not just to give you the push, but first you have to think, and you have to adopt the reason. You have to make the reason to your own reason. If I'm just telling you this is the best reason, but if you don't understand why this is a reason at all, then it will not have any impact on you. First you have to understand, okay, now I understand why this reason is so suitable for solving this problem, and then you adopt the reason, and then you might and then the reason might become action guiding. So I think reasons as such are powerless. They become action guiding only once the agent accepts the reason as a good reason, and once the agent makes the reason to his or her own reason. So this means that reasons must be accessible to you for becoming your reason. A cause instead must not be accessible to you. A cause can just force you to do something even if you don't know that you are like forced to do this. Just think about like in Freudian terms you might say there are many unconscious causes like directing or determining your behavior, and you're not aware of these causes. This would not be reasons. The reason would, you can only say, well, I did this for that and that reason because before that you were aware of the reason and you thought that this reason is a good one to act accordingly. So Jaquan Kim, he writes in one of his papers, the basis of your deliberation must be internally accessible for the simple reason that you can't use what you haven't got. So reasons must be accessible to you. Causes might be accessible to you. You might know that there is some unconscious drive pushing you towards a certain form of action, but it's not necessary that this unconscious drive is accessible to you. So I think this is another feature showing that reasons are different from causes. Therefore, if someone identifies reasons with certain events taking place within the person, then I think this is no innocent move, but it comes along with a whole package of ontological commitments or decisions. The reason gives an answer to the question of why someone performed a certain action. A mental event instead gives an answer to the question which causal conditions were in place for an action to take place afterwards. So if you just think about causal explanations, once you know the causes having or producing a certain effect, then all what you have to know is that which causal conditions were activated, and once you know, okay, these causal conditions lead to that effect, then all what you have to know is that these causal conditions were like realized, and therefore a certain effect followed. So providing someone with a reason for action is providing someone with an answer why an agent did something, and providing someone with causes for an action means to refer to the causal conditions that were met so that a certain effect took place. These are two different, entirely different questions and answers. So Jennifer Hornsby, she writes, an action explanation is not a reply to a question about why some event occurred. Rather, it shows a person's doing something to make sense by seeing her as at least approximately rational, as conforming more or less to norms of consistency and coherence in her thought and practice. So moving from the talk about reasons to the talk about mental events or events in general, I think that is a move from a first personal to a third personal perspective. And with this move from a first to a third personal perspective, also this different perspective in like providing different explanations for different answers comes into play. And this means also that if I'm looking for mental causes, then I'm not looking at the agent anymore, but I'm looking at the agent in terms of a place where these potential mental causes are to be localized. Now this brings me to my third and final topic, personal and subpersonal explanations. It seems that very often in the discussion the following move is made. First, people talk about reasons, then reasons are converted into mental events, then mental events, they have to be causal in order to be also like conducive for action explanation, and then at the end these causal events, they have also to be physical, because if they're not physical, then we don't know how they figure into this overall event causal framework. And at this stage, I would like to propose a Wittgensteinian warning. Wittgenstein was saying that we have to keep the different levels. If we ask questions, then we have always to look at which level, at which explanatory level are we asking a certain question. And he was saying that we should keep the explanatory level of the person and of her experiences, her desires, her beliefs, and so on, separate from the subpersonal level of neural and bodily processes taking place inside the person. So one might think that the distinction between personal and subpersonal is similar to a part-whole distinction. You know, like part-whole distinctions or mereological distinctions, that's just you have the whole and then you can divide it into certain parts out of which you can rebuild the whole. So just compare, you might say a certain gas, let's say helium, that's just composed of many molecules which compose a certain mass of helium gas. And once you know, you might also say that once you know how the different molecules behave, like what the features of the single molecules are, how they interact, then you know all there is to know about also the gas. And even if this is not the case, like if there's some additional properties like which the gas acquires at a certain threshold, then you might still say, well, you can access how the gas behaves and how the molecules behaves. You always access it from an impersonal point of view. When it comes to persons, however, the whole situation is very different. Persons are not merely composed out of more simpler bodily parts. They are not just comparable to a mass of molecules, but when it comes to persons, then we have to change, we have to make a change in the perspective. If we talk about persons, then we have to look at persons from a personal point of view and not from an impersonal point of view. If you look at persons from an impersonal point of view, then automatically the person as such gets out of sight. This might be appropriate for certain scientific reasons, but you have to be aware that then you're not talking about the person anymore, but about certain like bodily features, brain features, neurological features, whatever you have. That's all fine as long as you are aware that you're not talking about the person anymore, but about certain subsystems within the person, that you move from a personal to a subpersonal level. And I think to make this claim that we have to distinguish sharply between the personal and the subpersonal level, I think that's not a tribute to our ignorance in terms of, well, now we don't know how the way goes, but once science will tell us how we come from the personal to the subpersonal level. But I think that this is really, it's not just a matter of complexity, of more quantity, but it's really a distinction in principle. So the idea is that a person has certain powers to understand, to reason, to act, and all these powers, these capacities are out of sight if you go on the subpersonal level. So taking the personal level seriously means that you have to accept this level as a genuine level of explanation. It's not something that at some future point might be reducible to some other more scientific, like to some other scientific subpersonal explanations. And accepting the subpersonal facts as such, this does not provide answers to questions that are located at the personal level. So if you want to talk about desires, intentions, reasons, actions, then you have to go to the personal level and not to the subpersonal level. So just look at locutions as the following. You can read quite often in the literature, a desire and a belief cause an intention. That's talk on the subpersonal level, and what is more appropriate to say would be that a person desires X and believes that Y is the most efficient way to pursue or to realize X, and thereby the person intends to bring Y about. Or you can read quite often an experience causes a belief. The proper way of speaking would be a person believes something, a person acquired a certain belief because things look to her in a certain way, because the person made a certain experience. So at the first sight it seems that this talk about a desire and a belief cause a certain intention and so on, that this looks like an other way of speaking, that we are always speaking about the same, just in different terms. But in fact, the first locution, like this one or this one, this is really a talk on a subpersonal level. And if someone is not aware of this, then it very easily the person as such gets out of sight. And this creates not only problem to get the person back into the picture later on. So it seems very often that the move is the following. First you have the person, then you try to reduce it to certain subsystems, then you try to find out how the subsystems work, and then once you discovered how the subsystems work, then you try to rebuild out of the subsystems the entire person. But you forgot that when you move from the personal to the subpersonal level, that you were already abstracting from the person, and therefore at the end you cannot get that what you abstracted at the first, like in the first move, you cannot get it back into the picture at the end. You will always, all what you got to work with are just these subpersonal subsystems. So ignoring the personal-subpersonal distinction means that subpersonal explanations will be credited with explanatory work that they cannot provide. Because now, since the person get not back, since you somehow you try to build the person out from these subsystems, and now these subsystems, they have now to fulfill the work which the person was meant to fulfill at the first place. So now people talk about the brain decides, the brain intends to do such and such. And this means that you have different moves now, or, well, maybe, let's put it that way, if people try to save personal phenomena on this subpersonal level, then they have different options at hand. So one option would be you are aware that you are on the subpersonal level and you try to be a reductionist. So you could be a reductionist instrumentalist. I would say Daniel Dennett, he would be such a proponent of such a view. He would say, well, you can use the intentional stance, you can talk as if the brain would have beliefs, desires, intentions, if that helps to explain the brain's behavior or the brain's overall function in like causing certain bodily movements. So Dennett's idea is that we talk in terms of beliefs, desires, but in an instrumental way. It's not that I really believe, or as a like scientifically informed person, I know that that there are no beliefs, that there are no desires, but we are still allowed to speak in that way because this is the most efficient way for explaining our agency. So this would be one way you could go, that you could really say, well, there is no, these personal features, we don't need them, like in a robust sense. We just use them as useful instruments for our explanation. Or you could go the other way, and then you might become a kind of homuncularist. That is, the person is not like reduced, but it reappears at a lower level. So now the brain behaves now like a person. You know, like if people say, before you decide, the brain decides on behalf of you, or before you make a decision, the brain has already decided what you will then do. So this means that this personal, subpersonal level distinction is not like reappears on the lower level. Now on the subpersonal level, this personal talk reappears. And then again you might ask, well, does this not lead to a kind of infinite regress? Because then you might ask, well, now you have this little head, this little man in your brain deciding and intending, and does this little man, does he or she have again an even smaller homunculus which is deciding and intending and so on. So it seems once you go this homuncularist way, then you could also stay at the personal, subpersonal. You could just stick with the first distinction and say, well, we have this distinction between personal and subpersonal level, and we should just respect this distinction. So it seems that the move that which Dennett is making is the more consistent move. It's another question whether it's also convincing and whether at the end it pays also off, but at least it seems to be that if someone really wants to go this reductionist way, then he or she should go more with the reductionist instrumentalist way. Now let me briefly tie all of this together. So I was arguing for the thesis that human agents are powerful particulars of a very specific kind. They are powerful particulars endowed with rationality and freedom. Now, being endowed with rationality and freedom means, or in order to understand human action, that presupposes that we have to make reference to this kind of person, to this kind of agent. That means we have to make reference to a kind of agent that has reason and freedom. Metaphysically speaking, it seems that the more conducive metaphysical framework for such an understanding of human action is agent causation within the broader metaphysical framework of substance causation. Just remember the problem of the disappearing agent for event causal accounts. And from an explanatory perspective, personal level explanations, they have to be respected. Talking about reasons, that means talking on the personal level, so reason talk that belongs in an indissoluble manner to the personal level, and talk about causes instead belongs to the subpersonal level. I guess that's all. Yeah.